So I wanted to share a little clip of a ring-necked pheasant doing some territorial calling, and I do apologize that the pheasant in this clip is a little bit hidden behind that maple branch, but it's a really interesting behavior that is not super common to see, at least in the place where I'm located. I tend to hear it a lot, but it's much less common to actually see what the pheasant does when he's making this call. And this is a wild pheasant, so being a ground bird in a neighborhood where there are all kinds of cats and dogs and humans wandering around, these pheasants become pretty darn sneaky, and they don't really like to let you get too close. I think you really kind of have to be inside their core territory during spring in order to see this. And it's kind of one of those things where you just have to be in the right place at the right time. Otherwise, they won't let you get close enough. So this clip was actually shot from inside my home, looking out the front window to this big rock in the front garden. And on the surface, it might look like this pheasant is just standing on a rock. But there's actually something much more interesting happening here. This pheasant is doing a territorial behavior where he's getting up to a high point and slowly turning around in circles. And every few minutes or so, he makes a specific vocalization that if you have pheasants in your area, you probably have heard this sound before. It's one of the most common sounds they make, and even if you don't have pheasants in your area, you can still learn a lot from this example because most everywhere in the world will have some kind of plump, wild, ground-feeding bird with limited flying capabilities. You know, whether it's a turkey or a grouse or some other kind of ground bird, very often these birds all occupy a similar sort of niche, and they have similar survival strategies and behavior patterns. So the lessons that you gain from observing territorial behavior in a ring-necked pheasant can actually help you more quickly to interpret and understand what's happening with a similar species that might be living in your area. So this pheasant is a really great example of why you should never take animal sightings for granted. You know, you need to look beyond the surface appearance and realize that animals are always communicating more than what's immediately obvious. Because if all you saw was 2 short minutes of this random pheasant standing here not doing anything, you might be tempted to think it's just a pheasant standing on a rock. But if you watch carefully, this is actually just one section of a larger sequence of behavior. This pheasant is not just standing on a rock. What he's actually doing is being very alert. He's watching and listening into the distance, and he's very carefully lifting his feet and turning around in circles. And you're going to see that every so often as he stands on his high perch, he raises up his head, flaps his wings loudly, and makes a loud keek keek. So this is really the most exciting part, but it's important to see this call in the context of the complete behavior sequence in order to really get it. So you can see he's got his head raised up in a much more alert position than before. He's about to make his territorial call. And there he goes. He flaps his wings and makes this double keek keek. And what he's really doing here is both marking his territory to other male pheasants that might be nearby, saying, hey, this is my turf, stay away. And this sound can also be a way to attract the females and say, hey, I'm here, I'm powerful, I'm up on this rock, come check me out. And, you know, I've watched this guy stand up on a leaf pile and do this for 30 minutes, calling every 5 to 8 minutes or so, slowly rotating in circles, almost like clockwork. Sometimes, if you listen carefully into the distance when they do this, you can hear a female call back shortly after he makes this call. So you can actually hear the pair interaction, which is pretty cool. So if you have pheasants in your area, you're probably intimately familiar with this call, but it goes to such a more meaningful level when you can not only hear the bird, but also see what he does when he makes that call. It adds this really crucial layer of depth to your understanding of that bird when you connect your visual sense with your auditory sense. So I'll play it for you again. Notice that you can see him starting to raise his head, and then it all builds to this critical moment of activity. So the real lesson that I wanted to point out here for everyone is that if you want to understand bird behavior, animal behavior, even bird language, or any kind of subtle activity happening in nature, you need to practice watching for a longer length of time than your autopilot conditioning. You know, most people, if they even notice that there's a pheasant standing there, they probably would not have stuck around for those few minutes to get the complete sequence of behavior. We get so conditioned to move quickly through life, we're on to the next thing, and then we don't even realize what's been missed. So I'm always talking about how the ability to observe animals and understand what they're telling you is an actual skill. And if you get really good at this, you can learn so much about your environment. It's a really rewarding way to develop a deep connection with nature and the animals in your area. There are always deeper lessons that you can gain by looking closer and watching for longer lengths of time. So if you have pheasants in your area, have you ever heard this two-part call off in the distance of the forest during early spring? If you go exploring in those areas where you hear them, can you find spots where they might be perching, like big rocks or leaf piles where a pheasant might be able to get a commanding view of the landscape? If you don't have pheasants, who is it in your area that occupies this same niche of a plump, ground-feeding bird that slowly forages along the landscape? Who is it in your area, and what is their territorial strategy? I'd love to know what you're observing, and I hope you enjoyed watching this pheasant turn around in circles while I share some of my philosophy of nature observation and awareness. I really appreciate you joining me here, and I will talk to you next time.